When the phone of millionaire David Carter lit up at midnight, he expected another routine business alert, not the trembling voice of his elderly neighbor saying his little daughter Emma had just been slapped and dragged outside by his second wife. The message came with a shaky 30-second video. Emma, barefoot, crying, clutching her backpack while a woman's shadow shoved her toward the porch like she wasn't human. David froze. This couldn't be real. Lainey had promised she would love Emma as her own, yet here was proof of a cruelty he had never imagined. His hands shook as he replayed the clip, each sound of Emma's sob cutting through him like glass. He had been away again, another deal, another meeting, another excuse, and while he was shaking hands in a polished hotel lobby, his daughter had been standing alone in the cold, begging to be let back inside her own home. Shame burned through him, but something stronger rose beneath it. An instinct, a father's heat, a pulse that said go, move, now. He grabbed his keys, left the house lights on, and sped into the night, the rain beginning to tap the windshield like impatient fingers. Every mile felt like a confession. He should have seen the signs. He should have listened to Emma's quiet pauses, her hesitant smiles, her sudden fear of making mistakes. But nothing prepared him for what he would face when he stepped onto his porch and saw the truth waiting in the dark. Yet as the driveway came into view, David felt something else twisting in his chest, something darker than fear. It was the suspicion that this night was not the first time Emma had suffered, just the first time someone had been brave enough to record it. The closer he got, the more he imagined her small hands trembling, her eyes searching for him in the doorway. He prayed he wasn't too late to undo the damage already carved into her young heart. The storm outside echoed his rising dread, the moment that would shatter every illusion he had about his own family. David's hands were still trembling as he pulled into the long driveway. The house looked exactly the same, but something inside him had changed forever. While the rain softened, memories he had buried for years began resurfacing. He remembered being a child himself, standing outside a locked door in the dark. Back then, his father never came, and the silence carved scars he never forgot. He had sworn Emma would never live the childhood he survived, but somewhere along the way, the success he chased began pulling him further from her. Long hours, endless meetings, and constant travel slowly replaced bedtime stories and quiet dinners. Emma never complained, never asked for more, never questioned his absence. She simply waited, hoping the father she adored would notice the fear behind her smiles. As David stepped out of the car, guilt pressed against his ribs like a heavy weight. He walked slowly toward the porch, thinking about every missed birthday and broken promise. He wondered how long Emma had been hiding her pain to protect him from worry. The idea that she suffered alone because she didn't want to burden him was unbearable. David knew he had to face the truth he avoided for too long. His marriage, once hopeful and bright, had become a cage he failed to notice closing. But tonight, he wasn't the businessman everyone admired. He was just a father desperate to make things right. A deep breath steadied him as he reached for the door handle, bracing for whatever truth waited inside. He knew this moment could change everything: his home, his family, his entire future. But he also knew he could no longer run from the damage already done. Tonight he would confront the reality he had ignored and finally choose his daughter above all else. With his heart pounding, he stepped toward the doorway, unaware that a far darker truth was waiting. And in that fragile second before he entered, he sensed his entire world was about to break open. What he would discover inside the house would rewrite everything he believed about love and loyalty. Beneath the soft glow of the hallway light, Emma stood like a small shadow pressed against the wall, her backpack still clutched to her chest as if it were a shield. 11 years old, gentle, quiet, and painfully aware of the world around her, she had learned to survive by making herself invisible. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't laugh unless she was sure it wouldn't bother anyone. And every night before going to bed, she whispered a promise to herself. Don't cause trouble. Don't make Dad worry. Emma wasn't born timid. Life had carved that into her. She remembered the years with her biological mother, a woman who drifted in and out of her life like a passing storm. Some days were warm and bright, but others were cold and frightening. Eventually, the storm stayed longer than the sunshine, and Emma learned not to expect comfort from anyone. When David rescued her from that chaos, she thought the darkness was finally over. She felt safe for the first time, wrapped in the steady warmth of his patience and kindness. But everything changed when Lainey entered the picture. At first, Lainey smiled at her, bought her clothes, braided her hair. Emma wanted so desperately to believe it was real. She wanted a mother who stayed. Slowly, though, the smiles faded. The gentle touches became sharp commands, and the promises Lainey made crumbled into cold glances, slammed doors, and whispered threats. Emma kept quiet because she believed every problem in the house started with her. She told herself Lainey was stressed or tired or misunderstood. She told herself Dad was busy and shouldn't be bothered. She told herself she could endure it. But tonight had pushed her past the fragile limit she tried so hard to protect. As she stood trembling in the hallway, the echoes of Lainey's rage still ringing in her ears, Emma prayed her father wouldn't see her as a burden. Because deep inside, she feared one heartbreaking possibility. In that terrifying moment, her heart felt close to breaking. What if he chose not to believe her? Lainey stood in the living room with her arms crossed, her expression cold enough to freeze the air. Even before she spoke, David felt the tension wrap around the room like a tight coil ready to snap. She didn't look surprised to see him home. Instead, she looked irritated, as if his arrival had ruined whatever control she believed she had. Her voice came out sharp, accusing, already shifting blame before he asked a single question. She claimed Emma had been acting out, lying, and trying to manipulate everyone around her. David watched her carefully, noticing the way her eyes darted, the way her hands trembled slightly when she realized he wasn't swallowing her story as easily as before. For years, he had dismissed small signs, her impatience, her harsh tone, the way she spoke to Emma when she thought no one heard. But now those moments formed a clear and painful pattern. Still, Lainey pushed harder, raising her voice, painting herself as a victim who had sacrificed everything for a child who didn't appreciate her. She stepped closer to him, gripping his arm with a forceful insistence that made his skin crawl. She urged him not to trust the neighbor's video, insisting it was taken out of context. Yet every word she spoke felt rehearsed, hollow, desperate. Meanwhile, Emma stood in the hallway, shrinking smaller each second, afraid to breathe too loudly. The cruelty wasn't just in Lainey's actions. It was in the way she stripped away Emma's dignity with every bitter accusation. As Lainey continued her tirade, David felt a slow realization rising in his chest, one that made him sick to his stomach. The woman he thought he married was a stranger, someone capable of hurting a child who only wanted to belong. And as Lainey's mask began to crack, David sensed something else. In that tense silence, he felt the first spark of anger burning through the shock, a warning that he was about to uncover lies that had been hidden for far too long. The truth she was hiding was far worse than anything he had imagined. Lainey's voice rose again, sharp and slicing, but this time David didn't move. He felt rooted in place as he watched her storm toward Emma, her footsteps loud against the hardwood floor. Emma flinched, clutching her backpack tighter as if expecting another blow. That tiny, terrified movement broke something inside David. He had seen enough. But before he could step in, Lainey grabbed the backpack from Emma's hands, yanked it open, and dumped everything onto the floor. Books, pencils, a small drawing Emma had worked on for days. The papers scattered across the room like pieces of her dignity. Lainey pointed at the mess with a cruel smirk, shouting that Emma had purposely ruined her evening and embarrassed her in front of the neighbors. Her words grew sharper, dripping with resentment that had clearly been building for a long time. She called Emma ungrateful, pathetic, even a mistake. Each word hit David like a slap. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't defend herself. She simply bent down and tried to gather her belongings, her small hands shaking as she picked up torn pages one by one. That quiet, heartbreaking obedience made the room feel even colder. Lainey wasn't finished. She pushed the backpack back into Emma's chest, hard enough to make the child stumble. Then she shouted the words that froze the entire house. "Get out of my sight! This is my home, not yours! You only get to stay here because your father pities you." David had heard enough cruelty in his life, but nothing compared to watching his child tremble in the center of his own living room. He felt the room tilt, the air thicken, the anger in his chest rising like a wave he couldn't hold back. He stepped between them, his voice low but shaking with controlled fury. Lainey's eyes widened, not with guilt, but with the fear of losing the control she'd held over the household for far too long. And in that electrifying moment, David finally understood the depth of the darkness his daughter had been enduring, and he sensed he was moments away from witnessing the truth explode wide open. Emma stood frozen, her small fingers gripping the edges of the torn drawing as if letting go would make everything real. David knelt beside her, his voice soft, asking her to look at him. She hesitated, eyes glossy with held-back tears, afraid that speaking would only make things worse. When she finally whispered his name, something fragile cracked inside him. He asked her gently to tell him the truth, all of it, without fear. Emma's breath trembled as she spoke, each word like a confession she had been forced to swallow for months. She told him about the nights she slept on the floor because Lainey locked her door. She described the meals she missed when Lainey claimed she didn't deserve dinner. She admitted she stopped inviting friends over because Lainey mocked her for being too quiet to keep. David listened, horrified, realizing he had missed every sign. Emma wasn't dramatic, loud, or rebellious. She simply endured in silence, like she believed she had no right to ask for more. When she mentioned being shoved outside during storms, his chest tightened. He reached for her hands, promising she was safe now, but the guilt inside him felt like a weight he couldn't carry. Lainey, standing behind them, scoffed loudly, accusing Emma of exaggerating and trying to make her look like a monster. Her voice wavered, though, betraying a flicker of panic. Instead of defending herself with calm logic, she spit out excuses, blaming stress, work, her attitude. But David wasn't listening anymore. He had heard enough from both of them. The truth was clear in his daughter's trembling shoulders and in the way she flinched whenever Lainey raised her voice. His heart pounded as he realized he could no longer stay silent or passive. Something inside him, something fierce and fatherly, finally snapped awake. He stood, his eyes fixed on Lainey with a coldness she had never seen before. And as the room fell silent, Emma's confession still hanging in the air, David understood exactly what he had to do next, and the decision forming in his mind would change their lives forever. David rose slowly, and the shift in his posture was enough to make the entire room still. For the first time in years, he wasn't exhausted, distracted, or half-present. He was fully there, sharp, focused, and burning with a controlled fury that made Lainey's confident mask falter. He looked at her with a calmness that was far more unsettling than shouting. That calm meant he had finally connected all the dots she worked so hard to scatter. Lainey tried to approach him, forcing a shaky smile, insisting they talk in private. But David lifted a hand to stop her. His voice, steady and low, cut through the room. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. Why had she lied? Why had she hurt Emma? Why did she hide the truth every time he traveled? Lainey tried to twist the narrative, claiming Emma was manipulating him, that she was too fragile, too dramatic, too needy. But those excuses sounded thin, even to her. And David, who had once forgiven her sharp tongue and thoughtlessness as stress, no longer bought any of it. He pulled his phone from his pocket and replayed the neighbor's video, its harsh audio echoing through the quiet living room. Lainey's eyes darted, panic beginning to bloom. She started blaming the neighbor, accusing them of intruding, but her voice cracked in the wrong places, exposing the truth behind her trembling facade. David stepped closer, lowering his voice further, telling her he had ignored too much for too long. He admitted he had failed Emma by not seeing the signs, but he would not fail her again. Lainey's breathing quickened as she realized he wasn't asking questions. He was exposing the lies she built her comfort around. Emma watched from behind him, her small hands gripping the hem of his jacket, waiting, praying he meant every word. David turned to her, giving her a gentle nod that said she wasn't alone anymore. Then he faced Lainey with the resolve of a man who had finally chosen the right side. And in that heavy moment, the power she held for so long began to crumble, because David was about to deliver the one sentence that would destroy the control she thought she would never lose. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet intensity in his expression was enough to make Lainey back up a step. The tension between them thickened as he spoke the words she never expected. "I saw everything, and I'm done pretending I don't know who you really are." The sentence crashed into the room, stripping away whatever control she believed she still had. Her lips parted as if to argue, but David didn't give her the chance. He stepped past her, walked to the front window, and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, porch lights flickered across the lawn, and there, clearly visible even from inside, were the scattered remains of Emma's homework, rain-soaked and trampled. "Explain that," he said quietly. "Explain why her things are out there." Lainey's face shifted, first anger, then panic, then a desperate scramble for words. She claimed Emma had thrown them herself in a tantrum. She insisted the child was manipulative, but every excuse only exposed her further. David walked to the front door and opened it. Cold night air swept in, brushing against Emma's face. "Show me where she threw them," he demanded. Lainey froze. Her silence was louder than any confession. Emma stood behind David, trembling, her small voice barely audible as she whispered, "I didn't throw anything, Dad." He turned to her, and the heartbreak in her eyes made his jaw tighten. He nodded once, an unspoken promise he was already keeping. Then came the moment that shattered whatever was left of Lainey's facade. David stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "Tell me, Lainey, did you drag my daughter out here? Did you dump her things in the yard?" She shook her head wildly, but her eyes betrayed her. She sputtered excuses until her voice cracked under the weight of the truth closing in. And then suddenly, she snapped. Her face twisted and she pointed at Emma, shouting that the girl deserved it, that she had had enough of her weakness, that she was sick of playing mommy to a child she never wanted. The words echoed like a slap. Emma's knees nearly buckled. David's heart turned to stone. In that instant, something broke permanently, and what David said next would rip apart the last thread holding their family together. Emma's breath hitched as Lainey's cruel confession echoed through the open doorway that night. Her small shoulders folded inward, as if trying to disappear into the dim hallway. David moved instantly, shielding her with his body as her legs began trembling uncontrollably. He knelt beside her, lifting her chin gently so she wouldn't hide her face. Emma's eyes glistened, filled with fear and shame she should never have carried alone. David whispered softly, promising she wasn't to blame for anything happening inside their home. Emma shook her head, confessing she thought telling him would only cause trouble again. Her voice cracked as she admitted believing Lainey's threats that her father preferred peace. Hearing that shattered David, because silence had become his daughter's only defense mechanism lately. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as her tears finally escaped. She sobbed quietly, apologizing for not being stronger, apologizing for disrupting the household tonight. David felt his heart break, realizing she had suffered in silence to protect him. He told her firmly that nothing she endured was acceptable, not even for a moment. Lainey watched them with rising panic, realizing David finally believed every truth Emma revealed. She stepped forward angrily, insisting Emma exaggerated everything and was manipulating the situation tonight. David ignored her completely, focusing instead on calming Emma's breathing and steadying her hands. He asked Emma directly if she ever felt safe, and her silence answered everything. Tears streamed again as she admitted fearing he wouldn't believe her or choose her. David pulled her closer, promising he would always choose her, no matter the cost. Lainey's expression tightened with frustration, realizing her control was slipping rapidly from her grasp. She started shouting again, calling Emma weak and dramatic, proving her cruelty even further. David finally raised his hand, silencing her as anger filled every corner inside him. He stood protectively before Emma, making it clear nothing would harm her again now. Lainey's face twisted with rage, but David's unwavering stance warned her to stop immediately. Emma clung tighter to him, sensing everything was about to change forever tonight, and she was right. David rose slowly, his jaw tight as he positioned himself fully between Lainey and Emma. The room felt smaller now, charged with a tension that made every breath sharp. Lainey's face twisted, switching rapidly between outrage and forced innocence, as if she still believed she could talk her way out of this. But David was no longer listening to excuses. He was listening to his daughter's trembling breaths behind him. He asked Lainey one last time whether she had ever treated Emma with kindness while he was gone. She dodged the question, attacking Emma's character instead, claiming the girl was manipulative, dramatic, and incapable of appreciating everything she'd supposedly done. David's eyes hardened. He demanded to know why Emma feared her, why the neighbors had heard yelling, and why a child who never lied suddenly had detailed stories of being locked out and denied meals. Lainey snapped, accusing him of taking Emma's side like it was some kind of betrayal. David stated firmly that protecting his daughter was not a betrayal. It was his responsibility. He told Lainey he wanted the truth without distortion, without shouting, without blaming a child. But instead of answering, Lainey shoved past him and grabbed Emma's backpack again, waving it as proof that Emma needed discipline. That was the breaking point. David tore the backpack from her hands, slammed it onto the table, and ordered her not to touch Emma again. Lainey froze, startled by the authority in his voice. She tried one final tactic, insisting he was only being emotional because he had been manipulated. But David wasn't swayed. He told her directly that the marriage could not survive lies and cruelty. He said he would uncover everything she'd been hiding since the day she moved into their home. Lainey's expression shifted from anger to fear as she realized the depth of his resolve. Emma peeked around him, watching the confrontation with frightened eyes. David promised her that the truth would be revealed and that she would never be alone again. And Lainey understood this was the moment her control truly began to crumble. Lainey stood rigid, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. David watched her closely, noticing details he had ignored for months. Her sudden defensiveness when finances were mentioned, the hidden phone calls, the unexplained withdrawals that she always justified with vague excuses. Now, with his mind no longer clouded by trust or distraction, everything connected like puzzle pieces snapping sharply into place. He walked to his desk drawer, pulled out a folder he had avoided opening out of respect, and placed it on the table. Bank statements, receipts, notifications of declined charges he never understood. Lainey's face drained of color. He confronted her calmly, laying out each document like evidence in a courtroom. He asked why thousands of dollars had disappeared into accounts he didn't recognize, why credit cards had been maxed out under her name but linked to his address, why loan companies had been calling, calls she always answered privately. Lainey sputtered excuses about emergencies, family issues, misunderstandings. But David pressed further, revealing he had already spoken to the bank earlier that week after noticing irregularities. The more he uncovered, the more terrified Lainey became. Emma watched from the corner, holding her father's sleeve gently, as if afraid he might break under the weight of betrayal. But David didn't break. He grew clearer, stronger. He told Lainey he knew she had married him for comfort, not love. He had suspected for a long time, but ignored it out of hope. What he didn't know until now was that she had been slowly positioning herself to gain control of his assets. The cruel treatment of Emma wasn't just resentment, it was the frustration of someone whose plan was falling apart. Lainey's mask crumbled completely. She shouted that she deserved access to the money because she had put up with his baggage, pointing toward Emma with chilling disdain. David stepped protectively in front of his daughter, his voice low and final. He told Lainey her greed was the last confirmation he needed. Lainey's stunned expression said everything. She realized her lies were no longer weapons. David had seen the truth clearly at last, and the next step he would take would shatter the life she had built on deceit. The house fell silent after David's final words, the kind of silence that makes every breath sound like a confession. Lainey stood glaring, anger and desperation twisting together in her expression. Emma clutched her father's hand, still trembling, but now there was a fragile hint of relief beneath her fear. David squeezed her hand gently, guiding her toward the couch so she could sit. He wanted a moment to breathe, to think clearly, to anchor himself before taking the next step. But that moment never came. When he turned back toward the dining table to gather the financial documents, he heard the faint creak of the front door. His stomach dropped. He spun around instantly. Emma was no longer on the couch. The door stood partially open, rain blowing in. Panic surged through his chest like lightning. He ran outside, calling her name, but the porch was empty. The yard was empty. The driveway was empty. Emma had slipped out quietly, like a shadow disappearing into the night. Inside, Lainey crossed her arms with a smugness she didn't bother to hide. She claimed Emma was being dramatic, that she probably just needed fresh air, accusing David of babying her. David felt a cold rage rise as he called her out for letting Emma leave, for not even attempting to stop her. But Lainey simply shrugged, muttering that the girl always caused chaos and needed to learn the hard way. Her indifference was more horrifying than her cruelty. David grabbed his keys and phone, his voice shaking as he warned Lainey to stay away from him and not to contact him until he found his daughter. He raced out into the rain, shouting Emma's name into the storm. Each unanswered call made his heart pound harder. Every step he took felt like he was retracing the pain of his own childhood, searching for someone who never came. But he refused to let Emma feel abandoned the way he once had. He dashed down the street, desperate, terrified, praying for any sign of her. And just as despair began to claw at him, a faint sound echoed from beyond the corner, a voice calling his name from somewhere he least expected. Rain pounded against the pavement as David sprinted down the street, his breath burning in his chest. Every shadow looked like Emma. Every movement in the dark made his heart lurch. He called her name again and again, but the storm swallowed his voice. He searched behind hedges, down driveways, along the sidewalk where she used to ride her bike. Nothing. The guilt tightened around his ribs like a vice. He had promised to protect her, yet tonight she had run into the darkness believing she was safer out there than inside her own home. That thought nearly brought him to his knees. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the empty street for a split second. The silence felt endless until he spotted a small figure huddled near the edge of a vacant lot. Hope surged through him, and he broke into a run, only to skid to a stop when he realized it wasn't Emma, just a soaked trash bag caught on a fence. His chest heaved with frustration and fear. He wanted to scream at the sky, at himself, at every moment he had ignored the signs. He forced himself to keep going, moving farther from the house than he ever expected she'd wander. Then, just as he reached the old underpass near the edge of the neighborhood, he heard it, a faint, trembling voice calling, "Dad?" The word sliced through the storm like a lifeline. David's heart jolted. He ran toward the sound, slipping on wet concrete as he scrambled down the slope. Under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, he finally saw her. Emma sat curled against a wall, soaked to the bone, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She looked impossibly small, like the rain itself was swallowing her. David rushed toward her, dropping to his knees, wrapping his arms around her without a word. She clung to him instantly, sobbing into his shoulder, apologizing for running, apologizing for everything. He held her tighter, whispering she didn't need to apologize for surviving. For a moment, the storm around them didn't matter. He had found her. She was safe in his arms. but as he lifted her to carry her home, Emma's voice trembled with fear someone else had spoken to her before he arrived. David froze, still kneeling in the rain with Emma clinging to him. Her words were barely audible over the storm, but the fear in her voice cut deeper than anything he'd heard that night. He pulled back just enough to see her face. "Who spoke to you?" he asked gently, brushing wet strands of hair from her cheeks. Emma hesitated, glancing nervously toward the shadows beneath the underpass. For a moment, David held his breath, fearing the worst. Then, from the darkness, a soft cough echoed. David shifted, tightening his hold on Emma as an older man stepped into the weak glow of the street lamp. He was thin, wrapped in an oversized coat that had clearly seen better years. His hands were raised in a peaceful gesture, and despite his worn appearance, his eyes held a quiet kindness. Emma whispered, "He found me. He told me to stay where it was bright." David felt his panic ease just slightly. The man introduced himself as Henry, explaining that he often took shelter under the bridge during storms. He said he spotted Emma wandering alone, shaking, and he couldn't leave her in the open rain. He motioned to an old thermos near the wall and said he offered her warm tea, but she was too scared to accept. Still, he stayed nearby, keeping watch until she calmed enough to call out for help. David looked at the man with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for his kindness, sorrow for the contrast between this stranger's empathy and the cruelty Emma had faced at home. Emma told her father that Henry had spoken softly, telling her that good fathers always come back, even when life feels scary. Hearing that nearly broke David completely. He thanked Henry sincerely, offering money, food, anything he could give. But Henry shook his head. "Just take her somewhere safe," he said. "That's all she needs tonight." David lifted Emma into his arms, feeling her tiny hands clutch his shirt. As he carried her up the slope, he glanced back, seeing Henry fade once more into the shadows. The stranger had appeared at the exact moment Emma needed hope the most. Yet as David reached the street, Emma whispered something that sent a shiver through him. Lainey had followed them earlier, and she wasn't done. David tightened his hold on Emma as they reached the street, her warning echoing louder than the storm around them. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of Lainey, feeling a fresh wave of dread rising in his chest. Emma clung to him tightly, whispering that she had seen Lainey's car creeping slowly down the block before she hid under the bridge. David's stomach twisted as he realized Lainey might have followed them, not out of concern, but out of fear of losing control. He carried Emma toward the main road, determined to get her as far from the house as possible before deciding their next move. Emma trembled against his shoulder, asking if he was angry she ran, and he told her firmly he was only angry at himself for letting it get this far. He promised her she would never return to that house, not even for a moment, and Emma let out a tiny sob of relief. Just then, headlights turned the corner, slowing in a way that made David's pulse spike with fear and certainty. He stepped closer to the curb, shielding Emma again, praying it wasn't who he thought it was. The car rolled to a stop, its engine rumbling low, and David felt Emma bury her face into his chest as the driver's door cracked open. A figure stepped out slowly, hesitating as if unsure whether to approach them or remain still in the rain. And David braced himself, every instinct sharpening, because whoever had followed them into the storm was finally revealing themselves, and nothing about this moment felt safe. Rain pooled around their feet as David took a cautious step back, tightening his grip on Emma while trying to see the stranger's face beneath the shifting glow of the headlights. The figure lifted both hands slowly, showing they carried nothing threatening, but the hesitation in their movement made David's heart hammer even harder. Emma peeked up, her voice barely a whisper as she asked if the person meant to hurt them, tightening her hold when the figure finally spoke. David's breath caught as the figure stepped fully into the beam of the headlights. It wasn't Lainey. It was Officer Ramirez, the patrol officer who lived several streets over. He kept his palms raised, speaking calmly over the sound of rain. He said he'd received a call about a child running in the storm and came to check the area. Relief washed through David, though tension still gripped his shoulders. Emma clung tighter, recognizing the officer from school events. Ramirez asked if Emma was hurt, and David explained quickly, carefully, that she had been frightened and had run from home. The officer's expression shifted with quiet understanding. He didn't press for details, but his eyes softened when he knelt to Emma's level and told her she wasn't in trouble. Emma's voice shook as she whispered that she didn't want to go back to the house. Ramirez nodded, glancing at David as if to silently ask whether now was the moment to report everything. David admitted he intended to take Emma somewhere safe for the night and handle the rest in the morning. Ramirez agreed, offering to escort them in his patrol car to ensure they weren't followed. David hesitated, thinking of Laney roaming the neighborhood, frantic and furious. Accepting help was the only choice that made sense. As they walked toward the cruiser, Emma looked up and asked if her stepmother would be angry. David promised she would never face that anger again. Ramirez opened the back door, helping Emma inside before turning to David and leaning close. He warned him quietly that if Laney had already been searching the streets, she might escalate. David swallowed hard, knowing the officer was right. He slid into the car beside Emma, feeling her small hand reach for his. Ramirez started the engine, the storm fading behind them as they pulled away. Emma squeezed his hand, sensing danger, and David felt a deep certainty that the night was still far from over. Yet as they turned toward the main road, David noticed headlights reappear in the distance, the same ones Emma had feared earlier. Officer Ramirez tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the unfamiliar headlights trailed closer, their beams slicing through the rain like searching eyes. David felt Emma press against his side, her small hand tightening around his, sensing the danger approaching. Ramirez kept his tone steady, telling them to stay calm, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his concern. When the trailing car closed the distance, David recognized the shape of Laney's sedan, creeping forward with an unsettling determination. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't backing down. She was hunting for control she had already lost. Ramirez signaled to turn toward the main road, hoping to avoid confrontation, but Laney accelerated, pulling alongside the cruiser before swerving dangerously close to the passenger side. Emma gasped and ducked, terrified she would be dragged back home. David placed his arm around her protectively, urging her to breathe, reminding her she was safe now. Ramirez activated his lights, commanding Laney to back off, but she ignored the warning entirely. Instead, she rolled down her window and shouted through the storm, insisting David bring Emma home immediately. Her voice was frantic, sharp, almost unhinged. The officer slowed, preparing to pull over and de-escalate the situation, but David shook his head firmly. He refused to let Laney corner them again, not tonight. Ramirez agreed, accelerating toward the nearest station, explaining they were minutes away from a safe building with cameras and personnel. Behind them, Laney continued to tailgate, her erratic movements growing more desperate with each turn. Emma whispered that she couldn't face her stepmother again, and David promised she wouldn't have to. He squeezed her hand, grounding her fear with steady warmth. Then, as they reached the intersection, Laney made a reckless decision. She sped ahead, cutting sharply into their path, forcing Ramirez to brake hard. Tires screeched. Emma cried out. David grabbed her, shielding her as the cruiser jolted, and in that chaotic moment, Laney stepped out of her car into the flashing lights, soaked and furious, ready to unleash her final attempt to keep them trapped in her control tonight and beyond. Laney stood in the middle of the road, rain pouring down her face, smearing her mascara into dark streaks that made her look almost unrecognizable. Officer Ramirez stepped out of the cruiser with authority, ordering her to return to her vehicle immediately. She ignored him completely. Her eyes were fixed on David with a wild desperation that sent a chill through him. She began accusing him of betrayal, shouting that he had ruined everything she had worked for, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and panic. David stepped out slowly, careful not to frighten Emma further, and stood behind the open door to keep her shielded. He told Laney firmly that this was over, that Emma would never return to that house under her care again. Lainey shook her head violently, denying every accusation, accusing Emma of manipulating him, insisting she had been a perfect wife. Ramirez warned her again to step aside, reminding her she was obstructing a police vehicle. She screamed that she didn't care, that no one was taking her comfortable life away. Traffic slowed as drivers watched the unfolding chaos, some recording on their phones. Lainey's expression shifted when she noticed the cameras. Her panic deepened. She lunged forward, trying to reach the cruiser, but Ramirez intercepted her, blocking her path and ordering her to stop immediately. She fought against his hold, screaming Emma's name, pleading and threatening in the same breath. Then everything changed in a single instant. Ramirez informed her she was being detained for reckless endangerment, child endangerment, and interfering with law enforcement. The words hit her like a physical blow. She froze, her face collapsing as the reality settled in. The officers arriving as backup moved quickly, placing her in cuffs despite her frantic protests. David watched silently, holding Emma close as she trembled in his arms. He knew this confrontation marked the beginning of a long process, but the grip Lainey once had over their lives was finally unraveling. As the flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, Emma whispered that she didn't understand why her stepmother hated her so much, and David knew the hardest truths still had to be revealed. David held Emma tightly as they watched the patrol cars pull away, carrying Lainey into the blur of flashing lights. The rain had slowed to a mist, leaving the night eerily quiet after so much chaos. Officer Ramirez guided them back into the cruiser and drove them to the station, where they were given warm blankets and a private room to rest. Emma curled against her father's side, exhausted but finally safe. For the first time all night, David allowed himself to breathe. He brushed Emma's damp hair away from her face, seeing how fragile she looked, eyes red from crying, cheeks blotchy, tiny hands still trembling from fear. He promised her gently that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. She asked him again, in a whisper that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside her, why Lainey hated her so much. David swallowed the ache in his throat, telling her none of this was her fault. He explained that some adults hurt others because they carry darkness they never fix, and sometimes they blame innocent people to cover their own mistakes. Emma listened quietly, leaning into him, trusting his words even if she didn't fully understand. After giving statements to social services and officers, David drove her to the small lakeside cabin his parents once owned, a place untouched by Lainey's presence. When they arrived, Emma wandered inside slowly, taking in the cozy living room, the soft lighting, the quiet crackle of the fireplace. She walked to the old couch and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. David made warm tea, then knelt in front of her and said this was their home now, a fresh start. The relief that washed over Emma's face was overwhelming. She whispered that the house felt soft, like a place where no one would yell. David hugged her again, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. As she drifted to sleep on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, he watched her breathe, realizing how close he had come to losing her. This cabin wasn't just shelter. It was the beginning of healing for both of them. But as he stood there, grateful and exhausted, he understood something important. Emma's wounds wouldn't fade overnight, and his responsibility to rebuild her sense of safety had only just begun. David woke before sunrise, the quiet cabin wrapped in a gentle stillness he hadn't felt in years. The fire had faded to a soft glow, and Emma was still asleep on the couch, curled in the same position she finally drifted off in. For a long moment, David simply watched her breathe, peaceful, safe, untouched by fear. He felt something inside him settle, something that had been tight and unspoken for far too long. When she finally stirred, blinking sleepily, he knelt beside her and whispered good morning. She rubbed her eyes and asked if they really didn't have to go back. David brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and told her with absolute certainty that the house they left wasn't their home anymore. Their home was wherever they were safe together. Emma nodded slowly, relief softening her features. Later that morning, Child Protective Services arrived at the cabin for a follow-up interview. Emma sat close to David, answering their questions with a quiet bravery that stunned him. Every word she spoke confirmed how much she had been holding inside. When the officers finished, they assured David he had done the right thing and that Emma would not be returned to Laney under any circumstances. He thanked them with genuine gratitude, knowing this was the beginning of true justice. In the days that followed, news of Laney's arrest spread quickly. The neighbors' footage went viral online, sparking outrage and sympathy for Emma. Comments flooded in, people defending her, condemning the abuse, praising David for stepping in at last. For the first time, the world saw Emma not as a burden, but as a child who deserved protection and love. David and Emma settled into a gentle routine at the cabin. They cooked simple meals, took morning walks along the lake, and spent evenings reading by the fire. With every passing day, Emma smiled a little more, laughed a little louder, and leaned a little easier into her father's love. David, in return, felt the weight of guilt slowly lift as he rebuilt the bond he had almost lost. One evening, as they watched the sun sink behind the water, Emma whispered, "Dad, thank you for finding me." David wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his voice steady and full of pride. "I'll always find you," he said. And in that quiet moment, father and daughter stepped into a new life, one filled with safety, love, and a future finally free from fear. So, that's it. Our story comes to a close. And if you're still here with us right now, my friend, it means something in this journey touched your heart in a real, personal way. Maybe it reminded you of the power of protecting the people we love. Maybe it stirred something you've been holding inside. What David and Emma showed us is simple, but deeply human. Healing begins the moment we choose courage over silence. As the Stoics say, what stands in the way becomes the way. Pain, when faced with honesty, becomes a doorway to strength. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." David chose that power when he stepped up for his daughter, and Emma discovered it when she learned she deserved safety and love. Their journey reminds us that kindness can save someone, and truth can set an entire life free. If this story moved you, even just a little, do me a favor. Hit like, share the video with someone who might need its message today, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep growing this community of people who believe in healing, compassion, and second chances. You being here matters, and I'm grateful you stayed with me to the very end.